Welcome everyone to our webinar on hosting a successful virtual annual meeting. My name is Philip Sear and I'm the Member Relations Officer at the Fédération for the Humanities and Social Sciences, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. Bonjour à tous, je m'appelle Philippe Sear et je suis l'agent des relations avec les membres à la Fédération des sciences humaines et je serai le modérateur du webinaire aujourd'hui. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge that the Federation office and most of the staff are located on unceded traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. Members of the Federation are participating from across the country, and so we would also like to extend our respect to all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples for their valuable past and present contributions to this land. We would also like to take a moment to acknowledge the terrible tragedy that took place in Nova Scotia yesterday. We're thinking of our members in Nova Scotia and across the country that have been affected directly or indirectly by this event. And we would like to offer our sincerest condolences. Le webinaire d'aujourd'hui se déroule en anglais, mais nous vous encourageons à utiliser la langue de votre choix lorsque vous posez des questions. Nous ferons notre mieux pour répondre aux questions dans la langue posée. Today's webinar will be conducted in English, but we encourage people to use the language of their choice when asking questions. We will do our best to answer questions in the language posed. So we're holding this webinar today because we know that many of you will be holding virtual annual meetings in the near future. And even prior to our temporary normal due to the COVID-19 situation, there was already a strong interest among membership to think about how we may add a virtual component to Congress. So today we would like to talk about the Federation's experience and lessons learned from our own ongoing transition to virtual to help you organize your own virtual annual meetings. Today's speakers led the transition to virtual at the Federation, all contributing in different ways to make sure the virtual meetings were successful. So we hope that by covering several different angles, including governance, technical, and staffing considerations, that we can effectively share these lessons learned and encourage an enthusiastic and informative Q&A session towards the end of this webinar. Now, before we get started, just a few housekeeping notes. Today we're using GoToWebinar because we've used it before at the Federation and we wanted people to get a bit more familiar with it. So you can use the questions box to ask questions at any time. Our team will be monitoring submitted questions so that we can address them at the end of this presentation. And note that questions will not be seen by all participants, only the organizers. You can use the orange arrows to show and hide the chat box at any time. And in the handout tab, you can find bilingual PDF versions of this PowerPoint presentation, as well as an accompanying handout with additional details about what we'll talk about today. We will also be sending these documents via email to all participants shortly after the webinar. Now, with that, we have two objectives for today. The first is to highlight what you should pay attention to when organizing a virtual annual meeting. And the second is to provide some practical guidance on the tasks in the lead up, during, and post meeting. Now I would like to introduce Megan Wallace, who is the Federation's legal consultant and partner and head of not-for-profit and charity law group at Purley Robertson, Hill, and McDougall. Megan?
Hi there. Well, thanks everyone for having me today. Would you like me to start by going over the governance slides, Philip?
Yes, please.
Perfect. If whoever's moving them could, there we go. Okay, perfect. So I'll start by just giving a very brief summary of the state of the rules for both federally incorporated and Ontario incorporated corporations. I assume that many of your participants across the country are likely incorporated under one of those statutes, and if not, they'll need to take a look at what the guidance has been from the ministry in question in the province where they're incorporated. So in Ontario, you've got the Corporations Act, which, as many of you will know, is a bit of an older statute, so doesn't lend itself as well to electronic meetings. The Ontario government has announced an automatic 90-day extension for the requirement to hold your annual meeting within 15 months of your last AGM or 6 months of your fiscal year end. So Ontario, if you're incorporated in Ontario under the Corporations Act, has said you can just hold off on holding your annual meeting for 90 days if you want to. They've also, in that same order, allowed you, if you're an Ontario corporation, to hold an electronic meeting, even if your letters patent and your bylaws don't allow for it. So what they've done is said, look, we know that you can't meet in person, so you can either choose to delay, or you can interpret your bylaws as though they allow for electronic meetings, which is, I think, fantastic and very, very helpful. So don't panic if your bylaws don't allow for electronic meetings right now. If you're incorporated in Ontario, you're still allowed to proceed. Federally, they're being slightly less helpful. Right now, to delay annual meetings, you have to write to them to get permission. And while they haven't said that your bylaws will be interpreted to allow for electronic meetings, what they have noted is that the board can make amendments to the bylaws to allow for electronic meetings and put them before the members at this upcoming meeting. And then members can either accept or reject those amendments. But if they don't accept them, it doesn't mean that your meeting wasn't held appropriately, because the way that those bylaw amendments work is the board's allowed to make them, and then they're in force until the members approve it. So whether you're provincially or federally incorporated, you should be able to have an electronic meeting, even if your bylaws don't allow for it right now. So that was the kind of first main piece. The second main piece is just that your bylaws and policies very likely do have provisions on how to run elections and possibly electronic meetings, and you need to be cognizant of what those are. Although the government's saying you can read your bylaws as though they allow for electronic meetings, it's not saying you can decide to amend your bylaws in respect of how you run your electronic meetings. So you need to be cognizant that your bylaws and policies allow for you to do what you want to do in this context. The good news about these bylaws and policies is it's very possible that if they don't facilitate what you're doing right now, you will be able to amend them by resolution of your board in advance of the meeting to allow for you to do what you need to do to have an electronic meeting. So that's also very good news. I think there's one more slide that has a list of some of the considerations to talk about. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to just go over these quickly, and there will be Lemise will be speaking to this a little bit more specifically a little later, but I just wanted to give you the legal point of view on these points. So in terms of absentee ballots and proxies, if your bylaws allow for these right now, you can use them in accordance with what is being reflected in your bylaws. Neither of the governments, the Ontario or the federal government, have made any announcements that would allow you to change these provisions or how these apply. So you're really stuck with what you have in your documents right now as to absentee ballots and proxies. So essentially, if you don't have them in your bylaws, you can't use them right now, because these are the kind of amendments, if we're talking about a federal corporation, that has to go to members for approval. So this is a moment where you are actually likely bound by what's in your bylaws and policies. And the same applies to quorum, voting, and notice periods. You need to be cognizant of what exists in your bylaws. So one conversation that Lemise and I had earlier was that your bylaws may provide for quorum to only be in existence at the beginning of your meeting, or they may require for quorum to be there the whole during the duration of the meeting. So this is, again, something you'll have to look at your bylaws and your policies. Movers and seconders, we'll discuss the practical pieces around that a little later, but the bottom line is that an electronic meeting is very much to be held in accordance with the rules that apply to a regular meeting. So as all of your motions need moving and seconding when you are holding a meeting in person, they also need moving and seconding when you're holding an electronic meeting. There's no derogation from that requirement. In respect of observers, this is, again, something to look in your bylaws, but the same rules apply. If your bylaws say observers from certain places or certain categories are invited to attend your meeting, you cannot interpret that to not apply during this time, even though you're having an electronic meeting. Although you also don't need to allow the same rights for observers as you allow for members. You very much need to rely on your bylaws for that. And just the last point, we'll talk a little more practically in terms of elections later, because I think that's probably where most of everybody's questions are. But the bottom line is that the rules as to elections are also the same. So basically everything on this slide, you need to be cognizant of what your current requirements need you to do, because you can't take the position, well, because we're in a different context now, we are changing these rules, because these rules are already in place. For example, things like quorum and a notice period. If you were to say, well, because we're having an electronic meeting, we're not going to pay attention to those things, you could find yourself in a position where members were contesting the validity of the meeting or the fact that it was called. So that's my high-level piece on that slide. There's the next slide. Perfect. And the last piece that I wanted to touch on briefly before getting into the more practical components and allowing for questions is the requirements of law as to the technology. So both in Ontario and under the federal statute, and I think it's fair to say across the country, the requirements of law are that the electronic system you use for your meeting needs to be able to allow all of your participants, your members, to communicate with each other in real time. And the standard in law is, in quotes, adequately, communicate adequately, which is hard to pin down, but at minimum, you need people to be allowed to speak and engage with the meeting in real time. So one suggestion that's come up is, well, can we run the meeting without allowing for folks to raise their hand and ask questions? And the shorter answer is no, you can't. You have to allow for members to participate in the meeting as they would normally, which requires them to be allowed to speak, hear, and participate. The voting technology is another question that comes up. Right now, there is a written standard in the Canada Not-for-Profit Corporations Act on what that technology needs to look like. So you need to allow people to vote during the meeting, and you need to be able to allow the corporation to verify the vote after the fact, but while maintaining the anonymity of the individual voter. So not all electronic systems will allow for this, and it is important to keep in mind when you're shopping around for the system that you're going to use. You can use a scrutineer to assist with that process, but some folks have suggested things like using SurveyMonkey to collect votes or things like that, and that simply doesn't work. You need to use a technology that is compliant with the requirements of law. So I'll stop there and I'll pass it off to the next speaker, and I'm happy to stay here for questions and answer any questions that anyone may have on any of the items that we're talking about today.
Great. Thanks very much, Megan. And just a reminder for the audience there, we'll be having a question and answer period at the end of this presentation, and you can ask your questions in the questions pane. So to continue with the topic of governance, I'm happy to introduce Lemise Elzain, the Federation's Executive Assistant to the President and Governance Coordinator, who worked closely with Megan in our transition to virtual, to say a few words. Lemise?
Merci Philip and Megan. As the governance coordinator at the Federation, I worked closely with Megan, our President and CEO, and our Chief Operating Officer throughout this whole process. So now I would like to talk briefly about practical ways of running the virtual meeting from a governance point of view. First, I advise you all to prepare a script for the meeting. Because this is a new meeting format, a script or scenario that captures everything that you will be doing or saying during the meeting, step by step, will definitely keep you organized and help you stay on track before and during the meeting. Second, I would like to talk about some practical issues around the quorum of the meeting. Megan already covered the quorum's legal requirements, so just remember, a quorum must be available at the start of the meeting. Depending on your bylaws, some require quorum to be in place throughout the whole meeting, and some only at the start of the meeting. So please consult your bylaws in advance to know if it allows you to proceed without quorum if at any point during the meeting you started losing participants due to technical or connection issues. Next, I want to talk about the observers. Megan also covered the legal requirements for observers. So if attending the meeting, observers do not count towards the quorum. They do not need to be allowed to speak or vote, as they only get the rights provided for in the bylaws. So if your bylaws do not allow for observers, you will need to inform those who registered and update your registration list accordingly. This is why I cannot stress enough on the importance of monitoring your electronic registrations before and during the meeting. Next, about moving and seconding motions. We received a very practical tips from Megan before our first virtual annual meeting, which is to pre-identify movers and seconders for each motion. This is extremely effective when conducting a virtual meeting with a large number of participants. Having pre-assigned movers and seconders means that you do not have to unmute and then mute all participants to identify the movers and seconders every time a motion is on the floor, which could be sometimes technically challenging during a virtual meeting. So from our own experience at the Federation, while preparing for our annual meeting in 2019, different members of our board of directors volunteered in advance to move and second motions. At the beginning of the meeting, and when going through the rules of order, our chair mentioned that movers and seconders have already been identified. So when the motion was put on the floor, the chair announced that such motion has been moved by Mr. X and seconded by Ms. Y, and then moved straight to the discussion, then the vote. My next tip is about the motions. It is a legal requirement for participants in virtual meetings to be able to read and hear the motions when they are put on the floor for discussion and voting. Keeping that in mind, you have to make sure you are able to allow for votes on matters that you were not anticipating in advance. So make sure that the staff members running the presentation slides and launching the motions and the polls are prepared and ready to type new motions and polls and display them as and when needed during the meeting. My next point is about the absentee ballot and proxies. In addition to what Megan mentioned, when sending the absentee ballot and proxy forms to your members with your meeting package, make sure to set a specific submission deadline, which gives you enough time to tabulate the results. We gave our members up to 48 hours prior to the meeting, which allows us to also update the registration list with the members who voted via proxy or absentee ballot, making sure that no member is voting twice. My last advice is that you book more time for your virtual meeting than you would for an in-person meeting, just to account for any unpredictable delays due to connectivity or technical issues, for example. So if your meetings usually last for an hour, just book 90 minutes. If you finish early, you will make everyone happy. Merci à tous, and back to you, Philip.
All right, thanks, Lamis, and you too, Megan, for the review of governance considerations. Now, I'm sure many of you have met Lorna Hughescamp. Lorna is our business operations lead and has been with the Federation for over 9 years, working in technology, corporate services, and membership. She also coordinated a lot of the logistical side of our virtual annual meetings. So Lorna, what could you tell us about how everything came together?
Thanks, Philip. So putting together a virtual annual meeting is really a team effort. It's not something that you do alone. For example, we have a minimum of 6 staff, including Gabriel as CEO, who each have a role to play during the meeting, which you'll see listed on the screen as well as in the handout documents. It is possible to do this with fewer people if you don't have that many to help, but you'll want to carefully consider the responsibilities that each person has. During the meeting itself, it's helpful to have staff or volunteers completing each of the tasks listed. This includes controlling the slides of the PowerPoint or whatever is on the screen, someone to control the technical aspect of the meeting, someone to triage members' questions and read them aloud, providing IT support, taking minutes just as you would during an in-person meeting, and of course, the chair of the board will need to chair the meeting. This can be a lot to keep track of, so it's important to practice, and then practice some more. For example, you might want to consider doing between 10 and 15 dry runs before your first annual meeting. Even though the Federation is doing our 3rd virtual meeting this June, we're still planning on having many dry runs, including one in the morning of the main event, because the setup will be a little different with everyone likely still working from home. If you've been doing a traditional annual meeting for years, you know how the flow is supposed to go. The purpose of practice is to allow you to relearn that flow for the virtual situation. Practicing gives you a chance to learn your new role and responsibilities. Practicing also lets you fully test out the software and technology. We found that we had to make many adjustments as we learned what the software could and could not do. The only way to find this out is to jump right in and start testing. I really can't emphasize enough how important these rehearsals are for the smooth operation of the meeting itself. Now, I do have one specific tip, which is once you are starting to feel comfortable with the software, get a few volunteers to join in the next dry run as audience members so that you can test out what it looks like from the member's perspective. You can also practice how it will work when members want to submit questions. Now, before I get into speaking about software, some of you may be considering holding your virtual meeting via telephone or teleconference. It is important to ensure that you have addressed all of the requirements. In our experience, it was more practical to use video conferencing with a software platform rather than a telephone platform because it allows you to manage the list of speakers and attendees, use polls, and cast anonymous ballots. So taking a look at some of the features to consider when choosing a software platform. Obviously, you'll want a video conferencing platform of some sort, ideally one that allows the user their choice of connecting by computer audio or dialing a telephone number. This option reduces technical problems when connecting. There should also be screen sharing capability to allow you to display PowerPoint slides for everyone to see. The audience should be able to participate verbally in order to meet the requirements of the meeting. And a nice to have feature is the ability to submit written questions too. Now here's the kicker. As mentioned, members need to be able to vote on motions and the election, and it should be both secure and anonymous. This is where you need to do your homework and test out the software to see how their voting or polling option works. Next, the software should have a built-in registration form to help you control who signs up for and accesses your meeting. Then, depending on your mandate, you may need bilingual software in English and French. And you may want, and finally, you want a software that is reliable so that it doesn't crash during your meeting. And of course, you'll want to consider the budget for it. Please note, I have yet to find one platform that does everything well. In particular, it's a struggle to find video conferencing software that is bilingual or that does secret ballot voting. So moving on, you'll see a list of options for video conferencing platforms on the screen and in the handout. I am sure there are many more, but these are some ones to start with. Please note that the Federation does not endorse any specific platform. Each association should evaluate the features for themselves that I just mentioned and choose a platform that best suits their needs. The Federation happens to use GoToWebinar for our annual meeting because it suits our needs at this time, but with so many new options coming out on the market, we may reevaluate that for next year.
Lauren, I just want to jump in for 1 second because I want to ask a question that I suspect is on most of our participants' minds today, which is, did you consider any free or low cost options?
No, Phil, we did not. Unfortunately, in this industry, it really get what you pay for. So with many free options comes security risks, and also they don't have the voting or the polls feature that we need. Speaking of polls, so we also happen to use a separate piece of software. We use a separate voting or elections software platform to handle the absentee ballots prior to the meeting. The Federation chose to use Simply Voting for this. It's important to note that the two platforms don't integrate, so there is some manual labor to use the two platforms in tandem. You can see the full details of our process in the handout. In regards to IT and audiovisual equipment, we will be keeping it simple at the upcoming virtual meeting in June. All staff and participants are expected to be connected via computer from home with either a good quality computer headset or a telephone connection for the audio. Last year, we brought in a professional audiovisual company to help us include a video stream of the CEO and the board chair. This year, we are not planning to do any video in order to keep it simpler and less costly. Instead, we are focusing on screen sharing a PowerPoint file, and we'll include headshots of the speakers at the beginning, much like we did in this webinar. So next, when you're ready to start the meeting, all presenters and staff should log in 20 minutes early. Members should be encouraged to log in 10 minutes early. This helps to ensure there's time to deal with any connection issues, especially the audio. Remember to be in a quiet space. If you're at home, try to be in a different room than your family or pets. You'll also want to have a separate mechanism like email, texting, or a chat program like Microsoft Teams to be able to quickly send each other messages amongst the presenters as needed. During the meeting, as mentioned, you'll want to be screen sharing the PowerPoint slides, which includes the full text of the motions. After the chair reads the motion aloud, then it's time for questions. Members can submit questions in writing via the chat box. We then have a staff person dedicated to reviewing the questions. Anything administrative, like where can I find the meeting documents, is responded to individually in writing while the rest of the meeting continues. All other substantive questions are read aloud by the CEO for the entire membership to hear and for the board chair to respond to. It is also important to enable members to ask questions verbally if at all possible. There are two ways to do this in most platforms. One is to unmute the entire audience at appropriate times. The other is to ask members to click a raise hand button in the software, and then we unmute that member when it's their turn to speak. Unfortunately, we've had some technical difficulties with both methods, so it's something that we'll continue testing in our upcoming dry runs. We also currently use the built-in polls mechanism to allow members to vote on each motion and during the election. You could also choose to use a separate piece of software like Simply Voting to handle the elections, but then your members have to be logged into two systems at the same time, which can be tricky. Wrapping up, when the meeting is over, you simply close down the software panel and select the option to end meeting for all. If applicable, you'll want to download your recording of the event at this time. And finally, and most importantly, take time to debrief with your team. It will for sure have been a learning experience, and you'll want to document everything that you did along with notes for where to improve. You never know if you'll be doing this again next year.
Thanks, Lorna, a lot for the detailed overview. I think there's a lot of information there. So at this point, I would just like to remind everyone that you can download the supplementary materials in the handout tab of GoToWebinar, which includes all the details about what we've discussed so far. So with that, we would like to move on to the question and answer period of this presentation. And we have already collected a few questions, so let's jump right into it. So the first question is for Megan, and the question is, gosh, what if our new association is not yet registered?
Well, thanks for the question. That's great. I'm going to assume that what they mean is you're not yet incorporated, meaning that you are an unincorporated association that does not have an official articles of incorporation. So that's actually makes your life a little bit easier because you're not bound by the requirements of the statutes that we've discussed so far. So assuming that you're an unincorporated association, I expect that you would have a set of bylaws and or a constitution. So the advice that you need to have in terms of an electronic meeting is to conduct your electronic meeting in accordance with that document. If your document doesn't allow for electronic meetings, you could either take steps to amend it, depending on whether that's allowable, or if it's not precluded by the bylaws that you have, you could allow the board to make a decision to proceed with a meeting like that. But if you're an unincorporated association, the bottom line is that the answers are in your own documents and not in external requirements.
Great, thanks.
You're welcome.
All right, let's move on to the second question. This one is for you, Lorna. Can you recommend a CNAC compliant voting platform?
Good question. So in terms of voting platforms, you could use Simply Voting, the one we're currently using for absentee ballots. I'm not 100% sure that it's compliant with any specific regulations, but it appears to have the features that are generally required, including the fact that the ballots are both secure and anonymous.
Okay, thanks, Lorna. I have another question for you. If you could do an electronic vote, what software / platform do you recommend?
I have used Simply Voting myself, so it's the one I'm most familiar with, but any of the ones listed in the handout and in the slides would be good. The number one thing is to if you can get a free trial or a demonstration of the product so that you can see how it will work, that gives you a lot of information and understanding about what the features are. So I'd really recommend that.
All right, next question. This one is for you, Megan.
All right.
I wanted to know why the, okay, you're excited to answer. I wanted to know why the vote at the virtual AGM must be done anonymously, since we do not have anonymous votes at the in-person AGM. Thank you.
So this depends very much on your incorporating statute. So I can't speak to the requirements outside of Ontario and federally, but for example, the Canada Not-for-Profit Corporations Act requires that if a member asks for a secret ballot, you have to provide one. Many corporations aren't aware of this requirement, but this is very common in both rules of procedure and in corporate statutes. The idea being that you can proceed by a show of hands, but if a member asks for a secret ballot, you do have to be able to provide one. That's all on that.
All right, so I have another question for you, Megan, but Lorna, if you have a comment, you may want to jump in. How can a virtual conference be made accessible to those living with disabilities? What are best practices for accessible virtual conferences?
I'll take a run at that to start, but it's a great question and a tough one because it also depends on the kind of accessibility issues you have in your membership base. My inclination would be that you would send out an email to your participants as early as possible and ask if anybody will have an access issue, and then seek out a technology that allows for the kind of access that's needed. I don't know that there's going to be anything out there that would be perfectly accessible for anyone, regardless of their concern with access, but I would be happily corrected by Lorna on that. But my practical approach to that would be simply to reach out to your membership and canvass what will be needed to support your members, and then deal with your technology provider either to get that incorporated or have that discussion before you decide which to use. But I will defer to Lorna. She may know more.
I don't know too much more. It is a very good question. I would recommend sticking with one of the bigger providers in terms of software, something that's reliable and that's been well tested and well used. Another good thing to do is to provide the meeting documents well in advance so that there's plenty of time to for the members to read through the documentation or to ask questions, or if they need the documents in a different format. That way everybody is well informed before going into the meeting, so there's nobody trying to read or listen closely to catch all the nuance, just to help you sort of have everybody come prepared. And besides that, I would, again, what Megan said, listen to your members on if they speak up about what they need. And not just from a disabilities perspective, but when you're going online, you also need to keep in mind that not everybody has equal access to internet. So if somebody is having trouble connecting, this is where it's good to have a telephone option as well. But you really have to listen to your members on those considerations, and it's something we'll continue thinking about for sure.
It's Megan, if I could just jump back in and offer one more note on about what Lorna just said in terms of accessibility. The speed of your technology and where people are located really matters. So if you're an organization that's dealing with people living remotely or in the north, for example, this may be something that you need to think about in terms of what people's bandwidth are, and having an audio function, maybe not a video function, for example. I was on a call last week that involved people who are isolating at a cottage, and we had to get off the software we were using and use something else just simply because we couldn't communicate. So that's something you don't want to find out in the middle of your meeting. That's all for me.
I think those are good points, and there's a follow-up question that's related on that topic. This one's for you, Lorna, which is, why haven't you used a video for each of the presenters?
So in regards to today, one of the considerations was bandwidth, and we wanted to keep the connection focused on audio quality. We also wanted to keep the focus of the presentation on the material that we've collected, and having a number of video feeds coinciding with a PowerPoint slide can be a lot of things, moving pieces to keep track of. And finally, all of our presenters are working from home at the moment, and we didn't want to have to ask them to share their personal living rooms and such. So it is something you can do. You can do video, but I really do worry about the quality and bandwidth when you do. So.
All right. Don't go anywhere, Lorna, because the next few questions are for you. The first one is, could you please repeat the information on the technological requirements for voting? If anonymous voting is not part of the in-person annual meeting, why would we need this feature online?
Okay, so, well, as Megan mentioned, if a member requests anonymous voting or secret ballot, you need to have that technology. It's also important because, sorry, I'm just thinking this through. I'm actually going to pose the question to Megan regarding the anonymous voting.
So you've absolutely you've nailed it. The reason that we have to have it is because under most rules of order and many statutes, you have to be able to allow for a secret ballot. I will confess that I'm not familiar with every not-for-profit incorporating statute across the country. So it is possible that there are some that don't contain a requirement like that, but generally speaking, it's a relatively common requirement. So that's why it's needed. In terms of the requirement for the voting software, you need people to be able to vote anonymously, but you also need to allow for the corporation to be able to verify that votes were appropriately cast, and in such a way that they can't necessarily link the vote to the individual. So I know that some of the software that my clients have used for this is it allows for that kind of reporting. So it sends you a report that shows, in real time what the vote is. And then if there are questions about the vote after, you can go and dig through just to make sure everything proceeded appropriately, for example. So the requirements of the law are just that people can vote anonymously, and that the votes can be verified, but that the software also allows the report to go to the corporation in a form that doesn't break down the vote by member.
Yeah, to follow up on that, the list of voting platforms that we included in the handouts, all of these follow this requirement in terms of they'll show you who voted, and they'll require a secure login for each voter to connect to the system, so you can validate that whoever was accessing the system was correctly able to do so. And they'll show you the results, but they will not show you the individual results of who voted for who.
Sorry, it's Megan again. Just one more point. I just want to be clear that the voting standard we're talking about is the one in the Canada Not-for-Profit Corporations Act. So if you're incorporated under a provincial statute that we haven't discussed, it's possible that the rules are different. So your first stop is to take a look in the statute and in your bylaws for what the requirements there say.
Well, I think judging by how descriptive those answers were, I think that was a fantastic question. So the next question, this one is for you, Lorna. It's a follow-up on the question about the CNAC compliant voting software. Is the polls functionality in GoToWebinar a viable option?
So I can't speak to CNAC compliance, but I will say we have been using the polls. I would like to eventually move to a different platform that is has a better method for this, but it is what we currently use.
And another follow-up for you, Lornetta. This is another good one. You get what you pay for. Can you generalize what this will cost an association?
Ah, yes. Good question. First thing I would advise you is that if you're only doing one meeting throughout the year, don't purchase an annual license. Purchase a monthly license for 1 or 2 months, probably 2 months, if to give you time to set up your registration form 60 days in advance, and then also do many tests in the 2 months leading up to your meeting. And then once the meeting's over, you cancel it. So I can tell you that our current platform with GoToWebinar costs in the range of $300 a month. There are Zoom options that are much cheaper, but you have to add on the polling feature, which I don't have the cost off the top of my head. In terms of voting platforms like Simply Voting, you pay per election, often in the range of $200. So if you're paying $50 to $100, you've either got a very small meeting or that's about as cheap as it would go. If you're paying $1,000, that's the max. But if you think about all of our costs in total, it's definitely several $100s.
Okay, thanks. So just a quick reminder, we have about just over 15 minutes left and 3 questions. So if you have any questions that you would like answered, please feel free to write them down in the questions tab. All right, so let's move on to the next question. This one is for Megan. Do you read out all questions asked? What if you don't? Is there a legal responsibility to do so?
I assume what we're talking about is if we're collecting questions like we are here on the side and having them read out. I think for the purposes of basically making sure your members are comfortable with the format of the meeting, I think if there are questions that should be addressed kind of publicly and everyone should hear the answer, you should read them out. If they're questions that are related to the content of the meeting, I think it is very important that they are a part of the record of the meeting and a part of the overall discussion. So say you're presenting the financial statements and you're getting questions up the side, in the comment box, like we're getting here, people are inputting their questions and someone says, okay, line 46 of the financials, I want to know this. That's very important that be read out loud and answered out loud, because that is a part of the function of the meeting. If it's smaller stuff that is more related to housekeeping, unless it would be functional for everybody to hear it, it's not necessary. But when we're talking about the substantive items before the meeting, yes, I do believe that if you're collecting questions and answer in writing, that they should be addressed for everybody.
I'm just going to jump in here and with an agreement. So what the Federation does in practice is all substantive questions get read out verbatim so that the member hears their own question being presented just as they asked it, and so that there is no problem with the facilitators of the meeting potentially changing the meaning of a question by rephrasing it or anything like that. When it comes to the administrative questions, the housekeeping questions, those do get dealt with separately on the side. But if there's any question, if there's any gray zone of whether something is administrative or substantive, we err on the side of substantive and read it aloud, just to ensure that we are following the spirit of the meeting and not just the legal requirements.
All right, so now I have a question for you, Lamise. Would you send the motions to be voted on at the AGM in advance of the meeting?
Thank you, Philip. I will answer the question, but Megan, please feel free to jump anytime if you have a different opinion. Our bylaws require us to send the meeting documents, including the agenda items, the detailed agenda items, and the motions for each item between 21 and 60 days ahead of the annual meeting. So yes, we do send the motions in the meeting package. Also, depending on your bylaw requirements in terms of proxy and absentee ballots, if you are sending absentee ballots or proxy forms, you need to include those motions in order to allow for members to vote on them ahead of the meeting if they are not attending the meeting. So my answer is that we always do send the motions with the meeting package and with the absentee and proxy forms in compliance with our bylaws. Megan, do you have a different say?
I don't have a different note. I think that's quite correct, but I do have a couple of other comments. So not all organizations do send every motion in the notice of meeting. It's not required by law that you send the motions that are typically before the annual meeting. Normally, the requirement is that you send copies of any motions that constitute special business. So essentially anything that the members aren't expecting as the routine business of the annual meeting, bylaw amendments being a great example, you have to send a copy of the resolution in addition to the documents they need to look at. That's the legal standard. Even though you're not required to send a list of the motions for the regular business of the annual meeting to your members, I think it's actually a great idea if you're doing it if you're having your first electronic meeting, because that gives them a chance to make sure they understand the question and see if they have any thoughts about how it's phrased. The more you can give your members in advance for a first electronic meeting, in terms of just what to expect and what to know, I think the better off you're going to be. So if you're in a position to be able to provide that list with your notice of meeting, I actually think that would be very helpful for you in terms of making the meeting more successful and ensuring your members understand what's going to be put before them, because it can be, I think it can be a little intimidating the first time you're signing on to an electronic meeting like this. So the more information you can give them, I think, about what to expect, the more smoothly the meeting will go, would be my my 2 cents on that.
Thank you, Megan.
All right, well, Megan, don't go anywhere. Another question for you. Can you please confirm that the most an AGM can be delayed is 90 days for a federally incorporated association?
So a federally incorporated association does not have the authority to delay its AGM right now. That's only Ontario corporations pursuant to the Corporations Act. A federally incorporated not-for-profit under the Canada Not-for-Profit Corporations Act has to have its AGM within 15 months of the last annual meeting and within 6 months of the fiscal year end. If you're not in a position to do that, you're required to write to the Director of Corporations Canada and ask for an extension. The extension you can request is for a period of up to a year. And that extension has to be sent in 30 days before you would have to send notice of your meeting. So if your notice of meeting goes out 21 days in advance, that's the minimum according to the Canada Not-for-Profit Corporations Act, you have to write 30 days before that requesting permission to delay. So you cannot delay your annual meeting by 90 days if you're federally incorporated, only if you're an Ontario corporation.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
The next question is for you, Lorna. Do you run your AGM with simultaneous interpretation? If yes, how does it work within this platform?
Good question. No, the Federation does not use simultaneous interpretation, and we did not when we were running an in-person meeting. We strive to communicate using both languages, English and French, throughout the meeting. Anything that's very important gets repeated in both languages. And we accept questions from the members in both languages. Now, this requires that the chair of the board be bilingual and able to use both languages comfortably. If you were to use simultaneous interpretation, this adds another layer. We have not tested it out ourselves in a virtual platform. We could put some thought into it, but it's not something I have an easy answer for at the moment.
Okay, so the next question is for you, Megan. My understanding is that the CNCA requires that nominations are allowed from the floor. How does this happen in a virtual meeting?
That is the CNCA doesn't specifically say you have to allow for nominations from the floor, but you're quite right. A combination of a couple of sections in that statute do require that if a nomination from the floor happens, you can't preclude it. So you can go about that two ways. One, you can add it to your agenda and simply at a certain point say, okay, and now is the time when we're asking for nominations from the floor. You're not required by law to do that. So what some organizations choose to do is simply stay silent on it and allow a member to, if a member puts up their hand and says, well, I want to nominate someone from the floor, they allow them to do that. So what's going to work best, I think, will depend on your technology. If you're using a technology where you're comfortable that the member has a hand raising function that they can click a button and then be able to raise something, you can allow for it to happen that way. Or if you are concerned that there will be nominations from the floor and you just want to allow for it, you can simply announce that at the point when you are doing your nominations. It really is, I think, whatever is going to work best for you in that regard. One thing I did speak to a client about last week was perhaps sending an email to your members in advance of the meeting or including something in your notice package saying, we're aware that the legislation allows for members to make nominations from the floor. If you're anticipating making a nomination from the floor, it would be wonderful if you could give us a heads up. Given that we're working with this new technology, we want to make sure that we're in a position to effectively deal with any such requests. That's not binding on them, and they may choose not to, but simply saying, look, folks, if this is something you want to do, it would really help us out if you gave us a heads up so we could facilitate it for you. And then you'll know what you need to have in place as to next steps.
All right, thank you. I think right now that's all the time we have for today, but if you do have any more questions, you can feel free to follow up and write to us at membership@ideas-ide.ca, and we will do our best to follow up with any outstanding questions. So with that, whoop-a-die. Almost made it through without one of those wacky mistakes. So just like to thank everyone, and a light reminder that if you would like to have a representative from the Federation to speak at one of your association's virtual annual meetings, you can contact us at membership@ideas-ide.ca. And finally, on behalf of everyone at the Federation team, I'd like to thank everyone for participating today, as well as the speakers, who I thought did a fantastic job. Merci à toutes et tous pour vous rejoindre à nous aujourd'hui. And please make sure to fill in the webinar survey. We would really appreciate your feedback because it helps us create content that we hope is valuable to all of you. So thank you again. Best of luck in your organizations, and take care, everyone.